30 years ago, I bailed out of the city with just a few possessions, headed down to my mountain property deep in the southern Colorado mountains with only what I could haul in my truck. Me and my dog headed off for the grand adventure. This is a 17.5-foot self-contained trailer that I'd put on the property a couple of years earlier in preparation for the grand adventure of living in the outdoors. There was plenty of wildlife and plenty of quietude. I just absolutely loved it. I really wanted to live that way, and I had to try it. The wildlife was just amazing. Deer, elk, coyotes, mountain lions, all the birds of prey, eagles, hawks, falcons, fox. The list goes on and on. And of course, there were bears. It was bear country. So this is how it all started, right here in this little trailer. And I had no sooner unpacked everything and I got snowed in for the first time, and I just couldn't have been happier about it. This is long before the days of cell phones, and even when cell phones did come around, they did not work up there. There was no reception. And if you look just above my head up into the skyline there, you'll see a wire. That was my only form of knowing what was going on in the world. I ran a 75-foot long wire for a shortwave receiver, and I could listen occasionally just to make sure that the world out there was still going on. But for the most part, I was very content just to read books, get up in the morning, take a good hike around, explore, watch the wildlife. It was really just a great start to the whole adventure that was going to last the next 30 years. And after several months of living in that trailer and reading books and deciding what kind of a cabin I was going to build, I decided on this barn-shaped model cabin. And while I was in the trailer, I bought one of those solar panels that you see up there on the front of the house or the cabin. It was a 50-watt panel, cost over $200 used. And then when I put the cabin up, I put a couple of more 50 watts on there, and they were brand new and closer to $300 at the time, which was a lot of money back then, an awful lot of money. But the whole idea of being able to have power in this far of a remote place was just so appealing to me. So that's when I started learning what I could run off of solar. And those few panels right there really changed life for me. And the batteries that I used were the old lead acid kind. I try not to use them anymore, and this was long before lithium iron phosphate ever made the scene or anything like low temperature disconnect. So I just had a few lead acids tied together for those solar panels. I left them on the outside of the cabin so I didn't have any gassing inside my small living space. And it got very, very cold there. I put it on the part of the house that got sun most of the day. And even though I experienced freezing temperatures, those batteries worked pretty well for quite a long time. And as spring led into summer, I could hike up into the higher mountains to the west that were only unfrozen, these lakes, these alpine lakes, about 3 months out of the year. So in the summer months, it was quite a hike back in there, but you could get back in there and catch wild trout, cutthroat. And you can even see in this shot, one that I'm just beginning to get onto shore. They put up quite a fight, especially on a fly rod. Absolutely pristine, pristine wilderness. Many hours to hike back in there to these lakes, or hike up there rather. So while I was always working and building And settling into the wilderness, I always had a good time playing up there as well. My goal while living back up in there was always to be as self-sufficient as possible. And over time, I started raising some chickens so I could have fresh eggs. And here I am giving my baby chicks that arrived in the mail only 2 days old their first little drink straight out of the box they were shipped in before I put them into a little pen that was up in the loft because I had to keep it warm until they were feathered out enough to put them outdoors. So this was the first batch of chicks I ever received, and you have to give them a little bit of a drink to show them how to do that. And then you can put them in that pen where the food and water is, and they know exactly what to do after that. But you just got to get them off to a first start. Yeah, that was pretty fun. And once they got feathered out enough in a few weeks, they were able to go outdoors, and I needed to make them a place to live. And in the meantime, the wildlife kept wandering through. Never had any problems, would see the occasional bear wander through, just kind of moseying about. Never took much interest in the place, kept on moving. The coyotes were always more interested in what was going on with the birds, and didn't have any problem with them at this stage. So next up was to build a chicken coop. I actually insulated that chicken coop, even though the chickens could take a brutally cold temperature if they were out of the wind. I went ahead and insulated those walls for them just to keep it a little bit better. And that's where they lived. And then I built on an additional pen around that so they had a area that they could just be enclosed in a very large pen, a couple thousand square feet at least. And that's the old slab wood from an old sawmill that was down the road about 40 miles. And you could buy these remnants like this, the little slabs, for $40 a truckload, as much as you could fit into your truck. So I was brought back a couple loads of that, and I was able to make a pretty nice little chicken coop for them. And this is what the outside pen looked for them. They're getting a little bit bigger. They still weren't laying. And the reason I had this pen, although it was a nice large outdoor pen, was to try to keep the coyotes away. I was at this point starting to lose some from coyotes when I would let them free range later in the afternoon before it was bedtime. I'd let them wander around and scavenge for whatever bugs or critters they could find to eat. And then they would put themselves to bed just before sundown, and I could lock them up tight. Never had a problem. But I did lose a few to coyotes that would lay out in the edge of the forest and just bide their time for one that wandered a little too far away from home, and I would lose them. And over time, I added turkeys to the mix, a few geese, and a few ducks. The geese and the ducks pretty much turned into pets, followed me around like they were a dog, and probably thought that they were sometimes. Played with my dog and everything else. The turkeys, those were for eating, and they were great. And in between what was becoming a small farm life, still would hike up to those alpine lakes. These were all at or above timberline, and some of the best fishing I ever experienced was up in there. Just absolutely beauty. Unbelievable. Nothing like a wild trout on the end of your line. Added a couple pigs to the mix, built a little pig pen, started raising them up from what they call wiener pigs. And when I first got them, they weighed about 30 pounds, and they get up to, 180, 200 pounds before they're ready for butchering within just a few months. It does not take long to raise some pigs. And here they are singing for their dinner. They could see me coming a long ways away, and they knew what was about to happen. It was time to eat. Had a lot of fun raising those pigs, that's for sure. And because it doesn't take long to raise pigs, one day they were gone. Sent them off to market to the local butcher to make them into all the food that we could possibly need for quite some time. Filled a 9 cubic foot freezer that ran on solar, and that was that. So now I had this extra pen, and I decided to go ahead and do something else with that. So inside what was the pig pen, I made another little containment area for some meat birds. These were all roosters, and I started with 75 of them, and was also going to raise them strictly for meat. I had the egg production going quite well with all the hens and the other chicken coop. These were going to be raised strictly for meat. So here they are just before butchering time. And you can't see, but the pin goes back a little bit further. These are just the ones that wandered out, but there were 75 in there. Here we are into August, the first week of August of 2001. And it's just moments before my first serious bear encounter. So I had a Great Pyrenees up there who was a great protector, used to patrol the perimeter of the property all the time. He always let me know where anything was. His favorite toy, as they used to say, was a pack of coyotes. He could run off a pack, even if it was 6 or 8 of them. No problem at all. The coyotes would not try to stand up to a Great Pyrenees, and if they did, they would lose. And he always let me know where the bears were. He usually would encounter the bears quite a ways away from the cabin. He would smell them, and then you could just be sitting there with him out in front. He'd catch a whiff of those bears, and he would take off like a lightning bolt through the forest until he made contact with them, sometimes over a quarter mile away from the cabin. And he would start sounding off. And he made a particular sound when he encountered a bear. It was different than when he encountered coyotes. So he started encountering bears out there, and usually he would just stop barking when they wandered away. They usually wanted to just wander away once they had been detected. And here he is, just herding a pig back into the pig pen when it got away one time. Just on instinct, he knew how to do that. And that Great Pyrenees' name was Booger, and everybody loved Booger. These are a couple of my best buddies. Both of them have passed since. Sitting in the chair as an old mountain man, lived right up into his 90s, old George, and then the one petting him is Kenny, who was tragically killed in a motorcycle accident not long after this picture was taken. But everybody, when they were up there camping or visiting, they always felt safer up there, especially if they weren't from the mountains, because Booger always let you know what was going around. So it got to be that first week of August in 2001. I was asleep up in the loft of the cabin. I heard Booger make contact with a bear quite a ways from the cabin. He was making a lot of noise, and I went back to sleep as the noise as his barking got further and further into the distance, and I knew that he was always right on that bear, and the bear was making its way away from the cabin. And not more than a few minutes later, I was again wakened by Booger making all kinds of desperate barking sounds, some that I'd never recognized before. It had a bear alert tone to his bark, but even something more disturbing. And I could hear chickens screaming from this pen area where the pigs used to live. But this time it was chickens, and these chickens were being killed. So I bolted up out of the loft, came running outside with my shotgun. I knew that something really bad was happening, and it was. And I have to say that for years leading up to this August of 2001 incident with the bear inside the chicken pen, killing and eating chickens, I had seen many bears wander through, and they never really did pay me much attention. But I have to say that this particular summer was one of the driest on record at the time. All of the food that was normally produced at higher elevation was driving these bears lower, and there was a lot more encounters. More and more people were talking about various types of bear encounters they were having, and it was simply that they were driven down below where they would normally get all of their food because of the drought. So that was the biggest part, because I'd always lived basically in harmony with all the wildlife, and except for the coyotes occasionally picking me off for a chicken here and there, it was no big deal, and just part of how it works up in the wilderness sometimes. But this was different. This bear was he was serious, and he had to put on some calories because it was getting close to hibernation time. Now I came running out of that cabin, shotgun in hand, wearing whatever I was or wasn't wearing at the time. I did not stop to get dressed. I just went out the door, knew there was a problem, heard my dog alerting me to the problem, and there was a fairly good sized black bear sitting on his backside, sitting straight up. And he had a chicken in each hand, and he was just happily chomping away. And there were chickens in the pen hopping around on one leg. There were chickens that had their heads bitten off. There was so many dead and wounded chickens, I didn't even know at that time. I was a bit unnerved. He was not fazed by my presence. I quickly rifled off a couple of rounds above his head. He flew out of that pen and disappeared into the forest. And and then I had to deal with the carnage that was left behind. He had fully eaten 12 birds on that first night and left several more mortally wounded. After that first night of scaring the bear away with a couple of shotgun blasts over his head, I thought that would be the end of it. He came back the next night. And I have to tell you that before he even made that first strike of coming in and starting to eat chickens, for 48 hours he had been circling the property. I had seen him way off in the distance. I could sit right here and look down into the property deep, and I could see him, and he would just walk these very gradual, slow circles around the entire property and never really made any approach other than keeping his distance. And I came to learn later that he was absolutely wiring up my place for sound. He was getting the lay of the land, how my dog reacted, how I reacted, and he knew everything he needed to do before he started coming in to relieve me of all my livestock. So it was just a dream that I thought I would never see him again, and I had never seen a bear do this or act this way. But like I said, it was a severe drought that year. So he did come back the next night, and the next night, and the next night. This went on for 6 nights. At first, I had good old George come up long about sundown, and we would watch that bear start to circle us. And then at night, he would strike again. And old George, with his rifle in the background, said, "I'm afraid to hike up here anymore without my big gun." So started with one guy coming up to help me. We'd sit out there at night. I'd have 1,000 candle light, one of those spotlights, and we'd just wait for Booger to encounter the bear. And then all of a sudden Booger would stop barking. He would have the bear in his sight, And he would get within about 20 or 30 feet of that bear and just raise all kinds of hell with him. And so we always knew, even though it was pitch dark by the time he started encroaching upon the cabin, we always knew basically where that bear was. And then Booger would go quiet, absolutely quiet. And we'd be like, where did the bear go? Where's Booger? What would happen? And then we would hear a bird scream in the background from a totally different direction and turn that spotlight around as quick as we could. Booger would re encounter him, and all we would see is a bear running away with a chicken. And like I've told so many people over the years, the worst thing about having that bear problem, besides the obvious of all of your livestock being killed, was you get absolutely no sleep. So after about 5 nights of zero sleep, because there is no sleeping when you hear animals being killed and your dog's raising all kinds of Cain out there, and you hear stuff getting knocked over and broken, and it's just an unbelievable experience. But you get zero sleep, and I mean zero sleep. So I was getting a little crazy, and I started enlisting the help of other friends. We went from 2 of us sitting out there armed to 4 of us sitting out there armed to 5 of us sitting out there armed. And on night 6, with 3 different spotlights and 3 different guys armed to the teeth, that bear was still picking us off. In the meantime, during the day, we tried to start butchering some chickens to at least save a few. I had lost most of those 75 birds, and that bear had since destroyed the chicken coop as well. And it's just an unbelievable thing. You could light that bear up with one of those million candlelight spotlights, which lights the property up like daylight, if you're familiar with one of those things. I mean, there is absolutely nothing you can't see when that is lit up. And the minute we would turn that on and get a bead on that bear, he could just, in 2 jumps, disappear, and you would not know where he was. And then you would again hear something being killed behind you, off in a different direction. And we would just be amazed of like, how in the world did he do that? And he could throw my dog for just long enough to, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He could fake one direction, go the other direction, grab a bird that he was aware of that we were not aware of. I had birds that were hiding in the trees and everywhere else because the chicken coop was half destroyed, the pen was leveled, and he was putting on some calories getting ready for hibernation. So here we are trying to take care of getting some meat into the freezer, all dead tired from staying up all night for 5 nights. And then on the 6th night, we got a good line on that bear, and we spanked him good. On average, every night for 5 nights, he ate about 50 pounds of meat. When it was over, most of the chickens were gone. All of those 75 meat birds gone. All the turkeys gone. The goose here, my pet goose, survived only to be killed by a coyote a few weeks later. It was an exhausting experience. And I have to say that also one of the things that I was always very conscious of, I never really wanted to uh, have such an impact on my environment to where I would have to do anything like that. But this was an extreme year. Like I said, I'd always lived in harmony with these animals, never had a bear problem, saw plenty of bears over the years. This one was a unique bear. He was very hungry, starving maybe, down in lower elevation and raiding people's micro farms along the way. And when he camped out on me, he wasn't going to stop until I had nothing else to offer. And one night he had actually caught me by surprise. I did not know where he was, around on one side of the chicken coop, and I was on the other. And he came around and made a false charge at me. So he was actually dangerous. And he had to go away. So we did what we did up there, and we practiced the 3 S's, as they used to say: shoot, shovel, and shut up. So I survived those 6 nights in August, and it was never to be duplicated in any kind of a way. That was a very unusual situation and one I will never forget. After it was all over, I slept for about 3 days. I'd never been so sleep deprived in my life, and life went back to normal. I miss the old country terribly, and living out here in Hawaii now is a much easier type of living. Don't have to deal with the weather, and mostly the weather. But I miss the wilderness. But I will always have these memories. These were the glory days. Rest in peace, George, the old character mountain man. Rest in peace, Kenny, Mikey, Johnny, and so many others that are now gone. You made it all worthwhile back then. Love you guys.